They found the file deep within a vault beneath Whitehall. A metal folder sealed under Most Secret Admiralty Only. Its label, faded by time and frost, read, Convoy PQ-910, status missing. Subsequent report, all accounted for. The paper beneath smelled faintly of oil and Arctic air. The handwriting belonged to an intelligence officer who had watched the North Atlantic swallow too many men to count. Yet here, in this single folder, lay a case that defied every wartime expectation. A convoy that vanished, not destroyed, but surviving the void. A fleet swallowed by the polar night, and then returned. The Second World War was an ocean war. Beneath the thunder of tanks and the roar of bombers, it was the convoys that kept the Allied world alive. Columns of merchant ships threading through the Black Atlantic, carrying the iron, fuel, and food that sustained Britain, Russia, and resistance. To cross those waters was to gamble with death. Every mile from Iceland to Murmansk passed through the hunting grounds of the Kriegsmarine, German U-boats, the Grey Wolves, waiting in the depths. By early 1942, the Arctic convoys had become the lifeline of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union, reeling under the Nazi onslaught, demanded weapons and machines. In response, Britain and America formed a chain of convoys to the north, through seas few ships had ever dared. The routes were codenamed PQ and QP, one eastbound, one returning west. Between January and March 1942, the convoys PQ-9 and PQ-10 were assembled to deliver supplies to the Russian port of Murmansk. They would depart separately but merge mid-ocean. History would remember them as one of the strangest disappearances of the war. The images from that time are grainy and gray. Soldiers moving through snowbound landscapes, artillery echoing through the ruins of Europe. Yet the Arctic route was another world, a frozen corridor of death where winds scoured the sea into shards of glass. The men who sailed those routes were volunteers from merchant fleets, British, American, Norwegian, Dutch. Civilians trained by war, each knew that a single torpedo could turn the Arctic into their grave. The convoy PQ-9 assembled in January 1942 in Valfjörður, Iceland. It consisted of 8 merchant vessels escorted by a small screen, destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers armed with depth charges. PQ-10 was delayed by weather and mechanical failures. When the orders came to merge, communication began to fail. The Admiralty received fragmentary signals, then silence. Storms swept the Barents Sea, and German reconnaissance reported no contact. The convoy was gone. For weeks, British intelligence treated the disappearance as total loss. They knew the pattern. Convoy PQ-7B had already been mauled. PQ-8 had been scattered. The Luftwaffe controlled northern Norway, flying out of Banak and Kirkenes. U-boats prowled along the convoy tracks. To vanish in those waters was normal. To return was impossible. But PQ-910 did not sink. It had vanished into a fog so dense that radar failed. Captain William Edwards of the merchant ship Ocean Voice later described, "A silence so complete that even the sea seemed to have stopped. For 5 days the ship sailed blind. No stars, no wireless orders. The escorts had lost visual contact. Somewhere in that frozen labyrinth, the convoy took an unrecorded route, following ice leads across a drifting field toward the White Sea. Meanwhile, the war around them raged. Tanks were advancing across Europe. Cities were burning under nightly bombardment. Naval task forces clashed in the Mediterranean. The Arctic route, though small in scale, carried a weight of global consequence. Without it, the Soviet front could collapse. By February 1942, the Admiralty declared PQ-910 missing. A coded message went out. Convoy presumed lost. Proceed with PQ-11 under revised escort. The men of PQ-910 were, for all bureaucratic purposes, dead. And then, on a still March morning, Soviet shore stations at Murmansk began receiving faint Morse signals, call signs known to belong to the missing convoy. One by one, the ships of PQ-910 steamed into Kola Inlet, frostbitten but intact. Every man alive, their hulls were glazed in ice several feet thick. Their decks glittered like crystal. No one could explain how they had slipped through the most lethal waters on Earth without loss. The Arctic had hidden them, then released them. Intelligence reports reconstructed their journey. During the height of the storm, a freak magnetic interference disrupted radio compass bearings. The convoy turned north, away from the U-boat patrol line. What should have led them into disaster instead carried them into a pocket of safety between two ice fields drifting eastward. The Luftwaffe, unable to find them, bombed empty sea. For over 2 weeks they sailed without orders, rationing food, steering by instinct. The men repaired engines in -30 temperatures, shared frozen bread, and wrote letters they believed would never be sent. The Admiralty's declassified memo described the outcome with bureaucratic restraint. Convoy PQ-910 arrived Murmansk, 27 February 1942. All ships accounted for, 0 casualties, operation considered successful. But the men who lived it spoke differently. They called it the voyage into nothingness. As the war widened, the convoys grew larger and bloodier. Later that year, PQ-17 would meet catastrophe, scattered by false intelligence, decimated by German bombers. But PQ-910 remained an anomaly, the one that lived. In the vast record of the Second World War, their survival stood as a whisper against the roar. The footage shifts now. Fighter planes in formation, the aerial war unfolding above Europe. While convoys battled the sea, the sky became its own theater of annihilation. Every convoy was a magnet for attack aircraft, Ju-88s, He-111s, and torpedo bombers trained for Arctic conditions. To survive required coordination between air and sea. Yet PQ-910 slipped through without cover, beyond the range of friendly aircraft, relying solely on weather and luck. Some later claimed that the Soviet Northern Fleet provided unseen assistance, guiding them through the ice by radio silence. Others insisted it was mere chance. When the ships unloaded in Murmansk, they brought not only cargo but morale. Crates of ammunition, food, and American trucks filled the quays. Soviet dock workers embraced the frostbitten crews. A photograph from the time shows a British sailor grinning through a mask of ice, holding a tin mug of tea. Around him, the ruins of Murmansk still smoldered from the last Luftwaffe raid. Above them, aurora light shimmered in the polar night. Back in London, the War Cabinet studied the report. Churchill, obsessed with the Arctic route, demanded explanations. The Admiralty could offer none beyond favorable meteorological circumstances. The convoy's survival became a classified case study in navigation under radio silence, evidence that unpredictability could itself be a weapon. The Germans, expecting precision, had been outmaneuvered by chaos. Behind every convoy lay an invisible network of intelligence and code. In Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts intercepted Enigma signals detailing U-boat positions. Messages were relayed to the Admiralty's Western Approaches Command. For PQ-910, those codes arrived too late. By the time orders were transmitted, the convoy had already vanished. Yet Bletchley's decrypts would later reveal that German reconnaissance had reported complete loss of contact, presumed destroyed. The enemy had been deceived by absence. Elsewhere across Europe, the war consumed everything. Civilians fled bombed cities. Hospitals overflowed. Radio operators sent coded pulses across the airwaves, the language of secrecy shaping every front. The Arctic convoys became mythic in the Allied press, symbols of endurance. Propaganda films showed smiling sailors, frost glittering on their coats. The reality was different. Frostbite, exhaustion, the smell of diesel and death. Yet for PQ-910, the myth was real. They had lived what seemed impossible. When spring came, the surviving crews were dispersed across new convoys. Many would not survive the year. Ships like Empire Cowper and Ocean Voice later fell to torpedoes. But the record of PQ-910 remained clean. No losses. Every man alive. The file stayed sealed, partly because intelligence feared drawing attention to the route's vulnerabilities, partly because it seemed too improbable to be true. As the war pressed toward its climax, Allied landings, tanks rolling through ruined cities, the fall of Berlin, the Arctic story faded from public memory. The victory parades celebrated the grand offensives, not the frozen supply lines that made them possible. Yet the war's machinery depended on those convoys as surely as lungs depend on air. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the world rejoiced, but the Arctic route remained open until the very end. The final convoy, codenamed JW-67, sailed that spring. By then, hundreds of ships had been sunk, thousands of sailors lay beneath the ice, and still the ghost of PQ-910 lingered in naval lore, a convoy that disappeared and returned, proof that the sea itself could conceal its own miracles. After the war, declassification revealed the details. Reports from the Royal Navy's Intelligence Division confirmed that magnetic anomalies and atmospheric refraction during polar winter could distort both radio and radar. The convoy's detour was now understood as a freak convergence of natural forces. Yet no scientific explanation could capture the human element, the discipline that held those men together, the calm in the face of annihilation. The Red Cross records list no missing crew from PQ-910. In the prisoners' camps of Europe, where captured sailors carved days into wood, no one bore that convoy's name. They had all come home. In a war measured in millions of deaths, such statistics seemed unreal. Historians later compared the episode to the Mary Celeste of wartime seas, not for its tragedy but its mystery. For months, families believed their sons were gone. Letters of condolence were written. Then suddenly telegrams arrived. Safe. Arrived Murmansk. All well. Mothers fainted. Wives wept. Even the Admiralty clerks, hardened by casualty lists, paused before typing the final line. All men accounted for. In the industrial heartlands, women worked through the nights building the machines those convoys carried. Every shell, every truck, every bomber component crossed those seas. In factories from Glasgow to Detroit, riveters and welders knew the name Murmansk Run as shorthand for peril. To them, the story of PQ-910 became a whispered reminder that not every journey ended in tragedy. Decades later, when survivors gathered for reunions, they spoke not of heroism but of silence. The sea just closed around us, one said. It was like sailing through a dream that didn't want to end. They described nights when the aurora danced above the ice, when the compass spun uselessly, when the stars vanished. They remembered the sound of ice against hull like distant thunder, and the strange peace of realizing they might be lost forever, yet still together. The war moved on, artillery pounding through Europe, generals poring over invasion maps, the slow death of empires. But the Arctic sailors carried something the rest of the war rarely offered, a complete ending. No names carved into memorials, no missing men, only frost and survival. When the archives were opened in the late 20th century, researchers rediscovered the file. Inside, faded photographs showed the ships entering Murmansk harbor, their hulls shimmering with frozen spray. The men on deck looked like ghosts made of ice. In a margin, an officer had written in pencil, "The convoy that would not die." Today, few remember PQ-910. Its story lies buried among the numbers. Convoys PQ-1 through PQ-18, JW-51, RA-64. Yet it remains singular, the only Arctic convoy to vanish and reappear intact. A reminder that even in the most mechanized war in history, chance and will could still conspire to save. The war's final images show victory, flags over ruins, crowds in liberated cities. But beneath that triumph ran the silent rhythm of convoys, engines throbbing through fog and darkness. Their legacy endures in the idea that survival itself can be a form of defiance. In the long nights of the Arctic, where the sea meets the sky in frozen reflection, the path of PQ-910 is still marked on no map. The ice has shifted, the waves erased every wake, yet somewhere in that endless cold echoes remain. The sound of engines fading into the dark, the heartbeat of a forgotten convoy that refused to die. The war ended, but the questions lingered. Was it luck, or something beyond? A quirk of weather, or the will of men who refused to yield? The Admiralty's final note in the declassified report gives no poetry, only fact. All ships arrived, all men alive. But history, when read in silence, hears something more. A whisper from the Arctic, a reminder that even in the darkest war ever fought, the sea sometimes chooses mercy. And so ends the record of Convoy PQ-910, the forgotten convoy that vanished into the void, then reappeared months later, every man alive. It remains one of the Second World War's quiet miracles, buried in the ice, waiting for rediscovery.